The Soviet Union is a funny thing. While some idealize it and long for the old times, others talk about millions of innocent people sent to labor camps and rejoice in the collapse of this huge state. But where is the truth? And more importantly, what would have happened if the USSR hadn't collapsed? Dozens of dissertations and scientific papers have been written on this topic, but in reality, the concise and accessible essence can be conveyed in a few minutes of video. Right now, we will demonstrate how. After your comment about whether you would like to live in the USSR or not, because, as always, the process of the state's collapse was accompanied by a billion details. Any of them turning out differently could have resulted in a different outcome. Let's start with the main thing, the people. According to the All-Union Referendum of March 17, 1991, 77% of the residents of the USSR voted to preserve the Union. The referendum was very powerful, with nearly 150 million people participating. It created a funny paradox, as in fact, the result of the nationwide vote is more important than the directive of any of the presidents, leaders, or chiefs. The rulers of Russia, Ukraine, and other countries had to work hard to legitimize the results of the referendum as illegal or outdated. Many fans of the USSR still rely on this vote to this day. There are, however, a few important caveats that must be taken into account. Firstly, the referendum did not specifically address the preservation of the Union in its existing form. The wording of the referendum was deliberately vague, referring to the preservation of the USSR as a renewed federation of equal and sovereign republics. This means that people were simultaneously voting for the preservation of the USSR and for their own republics to become independent. The referendum was intended to establish a new union called the Union of Sovereign States, which is why the prefix Soviet was dropped from the name. However, some regions of the country declared their independence during the referendum, and the government, led by Gorbachev, tried to do anything to reform the federation and keep it within the same borders, even at the cost of dissolving the Communist Party. This plan failed, and the referendum itself is somewhat suspect, as some countries, such as Latvia and Estonia, essentially refused to hold it. The history of how votes were collected from those countries is unclear and is not particularly relevant today. The referendum and everything that happened since 1990 was a stage of agony. To understand what the world would be like if the USSR had survived, one needs to delve deeper into the causes of its collapse. Unfortunately, many people use the favorite argument of the opponents of the Union: toilet paper. Indeed, according to most sources, it was only by the beginning of the 70s that it began to be used on a mass scale. On November 3, 1969, the launch of the Rural Paper Mill Department took place, which produced ordinary toilet paper on an industrial scale. Of course, it existed before that, but not in the quantities and not in the hygienic form as in Western countries. Some claim that individual production plants existed even before World War II, and this is the very detail that caused the collapse of the Union. There were few reliable, independent, and objective sources that could be trusted. The truth had to be coordinated from above. Even disasters like Chernobyl were covered up until the last minute. And there was also the sinking of the Admiral Nakhimov, gas explosions, and numerous aviation incidents. The largest disaster in Armenian history is worth mentioning when in 1988, 77 people died in the crash of the IL-76M near Leninakon. All these events were covered up, which could not but create an oppressive atmosphere in society, as well as mistrust of Soviet technology in general. Supporters of the USSR still use all foreign achievements in science and technology to convey their thoughts to us. Already in the early 1980s, the term Soviet did not mean something of poor quality. The reason for this was the government's course towards mass production. Manufacturers were not interested in the quality of goods, the party demanded quantity. Since 1953, in the USSR, the evaluation plan for enterprises did not focus on quality. Only volumes were recorded on paper, and therefore, in the Union, the position of a car mechanic meant something magical. Everything depended on him, because cars broke down at every step. It is not necessary to delve into the details here. It is enough to say that the simple philosophy, imported is better than domestic, is still ingrained in people's minds. This was inherited from the atmosphere of the end of the USSR, and no arguments are needed to support this fact. The main mistake made by everyone who enters the debate about preserving the Union is communism. For some reason, the USSR is considered a communist state, but in reality, it is far from it. The Union was a semi-feudal empire with a clear ruling class, which was not the working people, but the nomenclatura officials, the army, and the bureaucrats. That's who ruled the country and was in different conditions. Look at the sign of the Soviet store of Birch. Are you aware that ordinary workers were not allowed to enter there? And inside, you could freely buy Mars bars, Ferrero Rocher chocolates, and any product of the accursed capitalists. Actually, this is what people who created myths about the most useful Soviet products were fed. Ironical, isn't it? Of course, many at this point will begin to throw facts and arguments against it. But there is one point that will describe the situation best. After World War II, Germany was divided into several parts, but Germans wanted to be a united country, and at the first opportunity they tore down the wall that separated them. At the same time, almost all of Eastern Europe was under the influence of the USSR. But when Gorbachev issued a decree on the cessation of interference in the affairs of other countries, magic happened. In 1989, communists were ousted in Czechoslovakia, in 1990 in Poland, and almost all the countries of the camp quickly switched to democratic rails. People simply didn't like the current system, which was maintained by the army and total censorship. When the USSR collapsed, there were no powerful movements for unification similar to the German one. The overwhelming majority of countries were glad for their independence and still rejoice in it, which means that when discussing what the world would be like if the USSR had survived, we need to consider several key points in time. Firstly, in 1991, after a referendum, the unity of the Union was maintained by force. Democrats and supporters of independence eliminated the KGB, and the good old Soviet Union was restored. What would have changed with such an outcome? Nothing. Imagine the current situation with an additional impossibility of leaving the country, obtaining foreign products, and receiving at least somewhat truthful information from the media. The power of the classical USSR was based on force, and we would already be in prison if the Union had not collapsed in 1991. Everything becomes slightly more cheerful if we go back 5 years to the beginning of the reign of Mr. Gorbachev. He had only one possible reform in that situation: perestroika. On paper, it looked great: freedom of speech, a transition to a market economy, fair elections. But it was implemented in the most inept way possible. Instead of glasnost, people received the concealed Chernobyl disaster. Instead of a market economy, they received food rationing. And instead of fair elections, they got numerous riots and the appearance of shady politicians out of nowhere. And for God's sake, don't call us fans of an HBO series. There is an official document stating that everything is fine at the nuclear power plant, and that evacuating Pripyat is unnecessary. No one rushed to save people until the kind Scandinavians detected the radioactive cloud. The nomenclatura did not want to lose their privileged status and did everything to preserve it. But if the Union had really been deformed as it looked on paper, the situation would have been more than amusing. Because the closest analog to the final state according to Gorbachev's plans would be the United States. Each state has its own laws, but at the same time only marginal units scream about independence. In Arizona, it is forbidden to feed pigs with garbage, and in Illinois, marijuana was recently legalized. This is approximately the structure that was planned in the Union of Sovereign States. Everyone does what they want, formally obeying a single center. The problem was that the top of the USSR did not want to lose the trough, and the bottom of society was too tired of the low standard of living and was ready to support anyone, just to change something. But if Gorbachev and his team had managed to carry out adequate restructuring, the world would have been a different place. Many blame the US for waging a hybrid war and imposing their values, but what prevented the USSR from doing the same? Only the lack of real competitors. Western cars, movies, jeans, and many other things that were only available in the West. And what is most important, there was not such powerful advertising of these products. With the opportunity to do business without kickbacks and theft, the still powerful production base of the USSR would have definitely come up with something decent. We do not have to look far for an example, it is in China. There, for a long time, they also copied Western developments, but in the end, they began to produce worthy analogues of Western products, which many people use even in the US. It is just that China carried out restructuring differently by coercing not the people, but the officials. Thus, there are two versions of a hypothetical surviving USSR. In the first and classic one, we would still dream of foreign kitchen sets, watching how the children of officials eat Kinder Surprises from shops for the privileged. And in the second one, the Union of Independent States, it would embark on a difficult but entirely achievable path of its own with its iPhones and Mercedes. Unfortunately or not, what happened, happened, and blaming only those in power is not fair. After all, the emergence of a fair and powerful state is impossible as long as people are satisfied with a low standard of living. People are, among other things, the source of power according to the Constitution, but not everyone understands that. Until we meet again, friends.